We've spoken at length during these live streams about the necessity for Christians to embrace the concept of judging with righteous judgment. It is a command that Jesus gives. And this is consonant with what we find in scriptures, more specifically the Christian ethic, and what it speaks about examining all things, holding fast to that which is good, and abhorring every form of evil. It is one of the primary instruments that God gives his children to protect themselves against ideas and concepts that arise against the knowledge of Christ and everything that stems, everything that sprouts out from Christ's teachings that inform the Christian ethic and inform the way that we have to think and behave. This, contrary to what Christians have been shamed into believing by many secularists, wherein they use phrases, for example, doesn't it say in your Bible that you ought not judge? Of course, they don't know where to find that in the scriptures, but they think it's a clever way to try to silence Christians from engaging in righteous judgment. In other words, calling what is wrong, wrong, and calling what is good, good. That's important to understand. But there's another aspect to this that needs to be examined that many Christians run afoul of, and that it clouds judgment, and that is partiality. The Bible has a lot to say on this, and I have a vivid example of something that happened recently in the interwebs that demonstrate this propensity amongst Christians vividly. So more on that in just a few moments, but please keep in mind that our epicentral subject for today's Irrespective live stream is to talk about the evils of partiality and how we need to stay away from that lest it cloud just judgment and even outright prohibit us from engaging in one of these instruments, like I said before, that God gives us to protect us from falling away from Christ. To welcome each and every one of you to this new live stream episode of Irrespective. For those of you that might be joining us for the first time, my name is Gio. Welcome all, welcome one, welcome all. As those of you that frequent these live streams will know by now, I'd like to get the housekeeping items out of the way so that we can dedicate the vast majority of what we engage in here in the live stream to the topic at hand. So, a couple of housekeeping items, which is to remind the audience that if any one of you who's watching this has not yet done so, subscribe to the outlets that we use on the different networks, whether it be YouTube, Rumble, or X. Your preferred social media, we are there. If you are consuming this live stream through YouTube and haven't subscribed, do so. Same thing through Rumble, same thing through X. Specifically, if you're watching this through YouTube or through Rumble and you haven't done so, hit that notification bell to be alerted as to when we post content and go live, which is consistently Sundays, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and also on Wednesdays at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to give us that, to smash that like button, the thumbs up button, and to share our content with others. If you'd like to interact with me during this live stream by placing your question or your comment in one of the chats, again, YouTube, Rumble, or X, we're watching them all, please do so at your leisure during this live stream. Don't forget to donate. It helps us to continue to keep the lights on here in Irrespective and do the work that we do to edify, illuminate, and to give commentary and edification through what we offer on our channel. Scan the QR code in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. To donate, conversely, you can follow the link that is available to you in the description box underneath the video player. Last but not least, do not forget to follow us on the socials. On X, our username is Irrespective77. And on TikTok, our username there is The Irrespective. All right, for the topic at hand, I'd like to begin by reading Noah Webster's Dictionary of the American Language, 1828, and see how he defined partiality. Noah Webster being one of the founding fathers of the United States, and his dictionary was heavily influenced by Christian principles as found in the scriptures. He writes that partiality is defined as follows: inclination to favor one party or one side of a question more than another, an undue bias of mind towards one party or side, which is apt to warp the judgment. So we see that there is this form of partiality, because let me tell you, there is a form of partiality which I'll get into shortly, and it's important to explain this because a lot of Christians don't understand that there are minutiae here that needs to be understood. Not all forms of partiality are sin, and I'll be able to prove that shortly. Webster gives us an excellent example to prove the aforesaid. But with respect to the wrong type of partiality, as I began to say in the beginning of this live stream, notice that which is apt to warp the judgment. So we already see that this wrongful form of partiality runs afoul of the dictate that Jesus gives us to judge with righteous judgment. Again, an undue bias of mind toward one party or side, which is apt to warp the judgment. Now, it's important, before I continue reading, to give some important pointers with respect to how one arrives at that point. Because as I said in the introduction to this live stream, a lot of Christians have adopted certain ideas and attitudes which are commonplace in the mainstream, which runs afoul to the way Christians ought to think and behave. I have a couple of texts that I'd like to read to the audience, for the audience shortly, but if you've read the Bible, you know that the Bible has to say plenty on God not demonstrating partiality and that we have to imitate that example. The thing is that in American culture and Western society, more generally speaking, when we talk about partiality, there are things that many people would rather not broach because it affects their finances. It bursts the bubble of persons that in their mind, they have to have an elevated status in their own lives, whether they be celebrities, athletes, favorite pastors, authors. You see where I'm going with this. Personalities that persons have a tendency to favor because they think that somehow they have given them some sort of benefit. So these people are beyond reproach. These people are beyond examination. They are beyond judgment. But that's not what Christianity proper teaches. Christianity proper teaches that God the Father, the way that he operates is that he doesn't show partiality. He distributes judgment and justice equally. It doesn't matter if the person holds a high position of rank or authority or popularity, or whether this person is the lowest of the low. He applies justice and judgment equally, and we are supposed to do the same thing. But American culture, Western culture, more broadly speaking, teaches something completely different. And this attitude, this way to approach the matter, is something that many Christians have adopted, contrary, dissonant to what the text actually has to teach on the matter. Please keep that in the back of your minds as we peruse this topic, because it's an important one. Webster continues, partiality springs from the will and affections. That's important. But notice the distinction here, how he separates one thing from another. What's this other thing he's going to separate it from? Partiality springs from the will and affections rather than from a love of truth and justice. I like the way that Webster denotes this, because in the one hand, he's saying there are those inclinations, affections that we have that are informed by the flesh, and that can't be supreme in the believer's life. What must be supreme in the believer's life is an affection for truth and justice, and that will allow you to not demonstrate any partiality. Allow me to expand on this just a little bit more to demonstrate how bad things can get if a Christian does not see things according to truth and justice, but allows the flesh to inform one's, as it were, inclinations. That's important. As a matter of fact, before I get to that, I don't want to leave what I said earlier about, I guess, a good form of partiality, we could say, we could call it. I don't want to leave that hanging in the air because I did say I was going to address it. I'll give you that example now. I'll continue that point that I was just on in just a quick second. Webster, and this, we need to get to this because it's a matter of understanding this. When we talk about partialities that aren't bad, Webster gives a great example here. A stronger inclination to one thing more than another, as partiality for poetry or painting. One person likes music more than another. One person likes the color blue and prefers that over the red. That's not a sinful partiality. So we need to have that clearly established in our minds, that not every form of partiality is a sin, because unfortunately some Christians, they will reduce this and come to think that every single form of partiality is a sin. And I know this could be a bit of an exaggeration of my part, but you get the point. The reason that I'm being so hyperbolic with what I'm mentioning here is to demonstrate that there is a contrast. There is a distinction here that needs to be made, lest Christians go to these places where now they start categorizing things that aren't sin as sin. And now you're binding your own conscience and other people's conscience over things that in reality they have no import with respect to the Christian living. Another thing that he mentions here is a colloquial use. Now, back to the example that I was going to give with respect to demonstrating partiality. Think about in our modern culture how a lot of people will intentionally seek to not call to account, to not denounce certain persons because that author, that individual, that personality, they might like the way they speak, they might like what they teach, they think they get some benefit from what those persons are offering. So when another person comes and says, they're wrong on this point, or they're wrong for saying this because it runs afoul of Christian principles of what the Bible dictates, you'll have those whom will voraciously defend them, even though you're hitting them with the evidence in the face, figuratively, that what that person is engaging in is wrong, what they're teaching is wrong, but they will vigorously defend said persons. Why? Again, based on what we read from Webster's definition, which is informed by biblical teaching on the matter, notice that those people are not judging with righteous judgment. So what it ends up doing is that it clouds the judgment and basically renders you unable, or indisposed would be the better term, to actually judge things with righteous judgment. This is why throughout my life, and I wouldn't call it a career, that term is not fitting for me, but in my life where I've talked about these things and people have given me their attention to talk about, certain topics and whatnot, there have been those whom have said, Gio, why is it that you're on two sides of the issue as it pertains to that person or to that subject? And I try to explain to these people, it's not that I'm on two separate sides of one issue. It's that I'd like to see things thoroughly so that I can make an informed decision on the matter and I can judge with righteous judgment. I'll give you an example to prove the aforesaid. A Christian judges everything by truth according to what we read Noah Webster is giving us in the definition, and I think he's right on the matter. Think about King David. Usually Christians, the first that I'm going to mention, there are more Christians on side A than side B. Side A being Christians whom lionize David to the point where David can do no wrong, or they lightly recognize his shortcomings, but they make it a point to even ignore it. They mostly lionize David as being this grandiose figure that requires us to celebrate him, idolize him in many instances. Side B would be Christians who say, well, yes, there's definitely good things about David, but the guy was mostly a bastard. And I know some of you will object to my language, but you know what I mean. This guy was a problem. Look at what he did. Look at what he did with Bathsheba. Look at what he did to Bathsheba's husband, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the things that he does. This guy is truly evil. When I look at what the scripture tells us, it's very clear that God leaves things imprinted in the scripture so that we don't lionize these people. He gives us the good qualities. David had good qualities, undoubtedly, but he also talks to us. He also reveals to us the man's sins. And it's so that we don't put trust. We don't get to the point where we elevate these people in a place where we suddenly don't question, don't examine. We suspend judgment because, again, our affections for that person now hamper us. We willfully put away just judgment for these things. So God in the scriptures, the way that he inspires this, lets us know very clearly the attitude that we have to approach the examination of all things with. The baseline, the foundation from which we judge all things is truth and justice, using Webster's words here, which Jesus is truth, Jesus is justice. That is the way that we have to view things. So for the persons whom are not acclimated to, they are not practiced in, some would call it an art, I would just call it a virtue. That's the way the Bible distinguishes it. In the virtue of examination, when they haven't practiced this, they have a tendency to go with the mainstream thought process on things, which is, I like that guy. I don't know why anybody's criticizing that guy. Look what he's done for me. But you're showing partiality at that point when you think about it. Or, man, that person is absolutely evil. And someone says, but wait a minute, look at the good things that this person has said or done. No, 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 no. I wish not to pay attention to that evidence. And I'm just going to be partial on this end of the spectrum. So it gets to a point where instead of analyzing things with just judgment, instead of arriving at conclusions that are based solely on truth, we tend to take the sides where truth is not wholly accounted for, if that makes any sense. Truth is not entirely in our mirror to make adequate judgments and examinations about things. And unfortunately, then that puts us at a disadvantage because instead of being like God and judging things righteously, just like Jesus commands us to do, we end up refraining from pointing out sometimes what is most obviously hitting us in the face. And now we put ourselves at the mercy of manipulators, charlatans, demagogues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I said at the beginning of this live stream that I was going to give you an example of the aforesaid. I'm pretty sure a few of you have heard of Piers Morgan. There's not a lot of good things that I can say about Piers Morgan. He is your typical 20th century media personality who hasn't seen a single sensationalist headline that he can't use to his advantage. It's about monetizing sensationalism. It's network news. It's that Jerry Springer, that sort of thing. There was an interaction that happened recently in one of his podcast episodes where he has 3 panelists on. One of them being Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire, of Ben Shapiro fame. Michael Knowles is an avowed Catholic, and he makes known every instance that he can that he is a Catholic. And he constantly harps on Catholic doctrine being the foundation for which he judges and falls on the sides of ideas, topics, concepts, what have you. So that being the case, we're going to judge him according to what he says his standard is. The particular topic that you're going to see that they talk about is the recent arrest of the Tate brothers, Andrew and Tristan, pretty popular in conservative social media circles, specifically what is known as the manosphere, for their rightful antagonism against feminism. Although these guys, by the evidence that has been put forth by a few people, these guys have a very, very, very checkered past. Not only that, many of the attitudes that they espouse are actually anti-biblical. Now, as I've said before, and I have asserted this, I can, just as in the case of King David, I can arrive at a proper conclusion looking at the evidence that a person like Andrew Tate could be correct, like a broken clock is correct twice a day. Meaning, he could be a dastardly individual, but he could say something that either contains a kernel of truth or the entirety of what he's saying at that point is entirely true, and not get to the point where I'm idolizing Tate, where I am lionizing him. I am just pointing out that what that person is saying in this instance accords with biblical truth. It doesn't make him a Christian. It doesn't make him suddenly a saint in my book, which is the tendencies. This is the thing that I'm trying to profile here with respect to the we have to be very careful because partiality, it's a thin line that has to be walked, as you note in the example that I'm giving. But the opinions are diverse about Tate, and they mostly land on the guy's a pervert, the guy's evil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or this guy's the best thing that the world has had to offer. So any person like myself, and I've been asked this before about Tate, whom says, I think that the guy's a sinner. I think he has done wicked things. And if he has, in fact, engaged in criminal behavior, he should pay for it. But at the same time, I recognize that there are things that he has said that Christians should have been saying for the longest time ago, but they haven't. And I can recognize that at least he is valiant enough to say that compared to a lot of the cowardice that we see in Christians when they should be saying that very same thing, which accords with Christian principles. But here's a secularist or an Islamist in his case saying it and not Christians. So I can observe all these things and they be according to truth, and they can all be truth true at the same time and be consistent? Well, they were recently arrested, charged for this, that, and the other thing. That's not even the point here. I want you to notice the interaction that is brought forth here by a commentator that she lives over the pond in Britain by the name of Pearl Davis. Pearl Davis has become pretty popular in social media because of her criticisms of feminist activities, thoughts, and processes. She has been through the podcast circuit. She has done much commentary with respect to how women in the West generally behave and how degenerate it is. All these things, her comments are pretty pointed criticisms of femininity in the West nowadays. But I want you to notice something. Based on the topic that I am sharing with you today, notice what happens when partiality has a tendency to make an appearance, even from a person, in the case of Michael Knowles, that says that they adhere to Christian principles. Take a listen to this.
All of that said, though, not only is there, I think, a fair bit of evidence that the Tates committed all sorts of crimes, but they did brag about a lot of this activity. You know, if the crime or one of the allegations that relates to some of the crimes is that they were pimps, you know, they prostituted women. Andrew Tate did brag about that. You know, he did brag about his degree as a PhD, a pimp and hose degree. They are open about having run pornography businesses. In some of the cases here, you have allegations from women who say that Tate raped them or abused them, and you have very consistent allegations here. But then, of course, in some of the allegations, you have women who say that they were abused by Andrew Tate for over a period of years. In other words, they were in a relationship with Tate for years, but some of his behavior was abusive or even criminal. And I think all of that can be true. So I understand why people raise their eyebrows at an investigation, prosecutions that have gone on in multiple countries for multiple years. But we should be clear about the facts here. You know, they have been open about a lot of very shady, dodgy, and possibly criminal activity. They are Brits who moved to Romania. Brits never moved to Romania to do good stuff. You don't move to Romania to go bake a pie for the widow, okay? You move to Romania to do really sketchy, dodgy stuff that they've been very open about. And so the reason I think people on the right, in the American right, have in some cases embraced or defended the Tates is because in certain cases they have the same enemies, the same kind of liberal, woke, globalist agenda. That's true. And also because these institutions of global liberalism have been corrupt. So that gives an opening to the defense attorneys and the Tates to say, well, look, just as Trump was a victim of the corrupt institutions, so am I. It can be the case that they're guilty as sin and the institutions that are prosecuting them are corrupt as well. I think both of those things can be true and very likely are.
To comment here in a short, in a very pointed fashion to what Knowles is saying, Knowles is accurate when he states that. And this is part of what I was talking about earlier, that when you think upon it, two things can be true at the same time and they don't contradict themselves. Because in the example that he's given, if we're Christians, if we're to judge things, the Tates can be corrupt and so can people who work in the government. That's a reality that can't be ignored. But there's a problem here. And you'll notice that Davis brings this up. It's the issue of hypocrisy as it pertains to Knowles' participation in an organization that actually gives space to people that have engaged in the same sort of sinfulness that Tate himself has participated in. You'll notice it.
Adam Solzig, welcome back to Uncensored. I want to play a clip from Ben Shapiro.
Let me just fast forward it here.
Nick Fuentes. You be sure from the outside, given you weren't there when this was all going on, how can you be sure they never crossed that line?
Well, I obviously can't be sure if I wasn't there. I don't know. But if there's facts that come out that back up the girls, then I'll go with it. But I think a lot of men in this country can relate. I mean, you guys have ex-girlfriends, don't you? You've never had an ex-girlfriend make up a lie about you, or you've never had that happen to a friend of yours. And for Ben Shapiro,
I want you to think here for a quick second here. This is a woman that is unabashedly demonstrating a lot of female comportment that even amongst conservative circles, they're unwilling to talk about. Be it that a lot of women whom consider themselves conservative are actually feminists functionally, but they give a lot of money to organizations like TPUSA and the Daily Wire and others. And the people that run these media conglomerates, they don't want to offend that group. So therefore, it's like we've profiled before with respect to churches, since up until recently, because that trend is slightly changing now. A lot of women were buying the Christian music, the Bibles, the literature, attending churches, et cetera, when a lot of these organizations try to monetize things that are related, adjacent, as it were, to the gospel, all these things, music, literature, et cetera, these groups, they don't want to offend their primary demographic that's buying from them. So they wish not to broach those subjects wherein it risks, so-called, offending your primary demographic that is buying things. See, you can point out the sinfulness of men in this generation, but in this generation, if you point out the sinfulness of women, it's a problem. And that's a problem that we have profiled on Irrespective, and we will continue to profile going forward, because it is, again, we're going to be prioritizing truth and justice in our minds. Then you have to point out the sin no matter where it appears. And you have to point out the partiality, again, talking about the topic, no matter where it appears. So Pearl Davis is making a great point here in that she's demonstrating that there is an intentional blind spot put by conservatives and Christian adjacent people in this matter, where they demonstrate that although they're willing to call out the issues that men, that the sinfulness of men, they're very reluctant and reticent to point the very same thing with respect to women. Let me give you an example here. When Knowles is talking about these women that were engaging in these things with Tate, I ask you, why would these women put up with that? Don't they have any free will? In the first sign that Tate is asking you that you do something unsavory, something immoral, something debauched, why would they say yes in exchange for money or whatever it is, popularity? That tells me a lot, not only about Tate, but about the people whom were called participants in these things. So you can't just point out Tate. You have to point out the women that were willing to participate with him in his debauchery. Oh, no, but you can't say that nowadays. But here's the problem, folks. What that does is that if you can't point that out, like I said earlier, you're intentionally blinding yourself to a particular sin, and that is a form of partiality, and that's something that Christians need to stop.
It's pretty hypocritical of him to crucify the Tates when the Daily Wire has ex-porn stars on their platforms. So they've had Nala Ray, they had on Lauren Southern.
Now note how quickly Knowles jumps in here, because his paycheck is being affected. So now he's going to be quick to defend the Daily Wire. And notice how he brings in reformed porn stars. Okay. So there can't be reformed pornographers? Just to give an example. Yeah, but Tate is not a reformed pornographer. That's not the point. The point is the double standard. The point is the demonstration of partiality. Folks, come on, let's be honest here. Do you actually think that conservative media outlets aren't crafty enough to say, there's a lot of men in conservative spaces that would be willing to see these former porn stars talk about Jesus? Let's go ahead and pay them a little bit and give them a microphone and put a camera in their face so that they could talk about Christian virtues. You don't think that so-called conservative and Christian organizations are beyond that, or that they're not susceptible to think that way? Come on. Again, let's not be stupid. This is what happens when you end up practicing partiality. It makes you stupid. It makes you blind to hypocrisies. So Davis here is absolutely right in bringing this forth. It's a vivid example of what we're talking about today.
Dude, yeah,
Wait,
I know.
Lauren Southern a porn star? That's news to me.
Now, I want you to notice the way that Knowles continues to interrupt her. It's a very crafty way to filibuster. He was allowed to make his point uninterrupted, and then when Davis brings up the issue of the company that he works for and the hypocrisies that they're engaging in, he's very quick to get defensive. So my point is, he's a rabid Catholic. I thought Catholics, supposedly, according to the myth, they follow the exact same Bible that we do and the same principles that Protestant Christians do. Well, if God doesn't show, the Catholic God doesn't show partiality and the Protestant God doesn't show partiality, then I would ask you, why is all of a sudden he being so dishonest and defending his moneyed interest? But that's not the cover. The clever cover is, I make money from this company, so it behooves me to defend our hypocrisy. Where is the honesty in that? Where is the truthfulness in that? A vivid example. I told you I would give you a vivid example.
Maybe not technically, but she falsely accused
Or
a
at
bunch
all.
of guys in the conservative party. Like it's, women will do the most egregious of sins and do the most egregious things, and you guys all put them on your platforms. There's no question about it. But if
Well,
a guy,
there are a lot of
profits off
questions
female
in interviews that go
sexuality-
on for a long time. But there are a lot of, that's what an interview is. But then also, I think the crucial point you're missing,
Right,
Pearl,
but you give
is
them
that
softball
it's one thing to put on
interviews
people
that you
who
would
have
never give a
reformed
guy.
and repented,
You give them
not people who
softball
are
interviews.
unrepentant.
You give them softball interviews that you
I need to challenge Noel's assertion here. True repentance looks something like a complete reversal. Not something like it. It is a complete reversal of the way, you were acting before. But when you look at a lot of these former so-called porn stars now suddenly have a come to Jesus moment, you'll notice that they still love the spotlight as much as they did when they were taking their clothes off for the camera and doing salacious acts. Why, having converted 2 months ago, are all of a sudden these people being given pulpits to preach? Very interesting.
never give the
That is demonstrating partiality. This is my point. And Christians, we need to be honest. We need to arrive and be honest and say, is my judgment in this matter affected by my inclinations that are not completely pure, my affections which are not completely pure, or are they informed by truth and by justice?
guy, and there's never any penance for it. So it's like, it's pretty hypocritical that they're
Mind you, this is interesting that Davis, I don't know if she's a Christian. I don't think she is. I don't think she's ever made a profession of faith. Neither has she demonstrated that she is, in fact, a believer in the most traditional sense. But the fact that, once again, here is a sinner, by all accounts, calling this out, and Christians are unwilling, demonstrates the level of partiality that exists within the church that needs to be expurgated.
crucifying the Tates for making money off of cam work when you don't crucify the porn stars that come on your platform that also made money off of cam work. Like there's a bunch
we
of
try not to
OnlyFans models
crucify
out
people.
there.
I agree. That's
some
true. We try
people-
not to do that. But I think
Yeah,
you're
I
making
mean, I
an
know
apples
it's
and
like,
oranges comparison.
I know you,
But you see, when they say, when he says things like, we try not to crucify these individuals, what does he necessarily mean by that? She mentioned it earlier. It's more of a softball interview because we have this new personality that we know is going to attract a lot of attention to our channel. And it's best if we whitewash this person's activities because it's a personality that we want people to pay money to see or pay attention to because we can sell a lot of ads. You see, again, there's a lot of disingenuous activity here from a person who says that they are a rabid Catholic, supposedly a subscriber to ideas of, biblical Catholicism, as they say, or Catholic biblicalism. I don't know however they classify it.
I know you think, I know you think it's funny, but like, this is a
Am I
claim from
laughing
like
at
10
you?
years ago.
Not on camera, at least.
This is a claim from like 10 years ago. So it's like,
Mind you, this is the funny thing about it. Sometimes these things can get so flippant, and Knowles is one of these people that he knows he's very crafty. He decides to get flippant here to try to make her point seem invalid, and her point is very valid. So now he's reducing, instead of actually arguing substantively, he's actually trying to mock her to distract from the main point that she's bringing. Again, the issues of partiality continue to rear their ugly head. Let me give you a couple of texts here, folks. You have Leviticus 19:15. From the Old Testament, this is an issue. You shall not do injustice in judgment. You shall not show partiality to the powerless. You shall not give preference to the powerful. You shall judge your fellow citizen with justice. Deuteronomy 16:19. You shall not subvert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not take a bribe, for the bribe makes blind the eyes of the wise and misrepresents the words of the righteous. Another text here, Proverbs 24:23. These sayings are also for the wise. Partiality in judgment is not good. What you're seeing here is an example of the aforesaid. Proverbs 28:21, showing partiality is not good, and over a morsel of bread a strong man will do wrong. New Testament, Acts 10:34, Peter opened his mouth and said, in truth, I understand that God is not one who shows partiality. Romans 2:11, for there is no partiality with God. Galatians 2:6. But from those who were influential, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. This is the Apostle Paul. God does not show partiality. And you have a ton of other verses here that, in essence, dictate the same thing. But look at the effects of demonstrating partiality. So now the truthfulness of the matter, the truthfulness of the vividness of this hypocrisy, he's trying to downplay it. He's trying to repress it for the sake of his moneyed interests. How Christian is that? See, the problems with partiality is they render just judgment, or they try to render just judgment null. And it's a sin when Christians engage in it. One of the abominations that we find in Proverbs that God talks about as an abomination to him is false witness. Partiality leads to false witness. You're seeing this guy committed, even though he's a rabid Catholic. You see the problems?
But Paul, that doesn't make it automatically untrue.
I know.
And what we now have nearly 60 charges, and these aren't just trivial charges. These involve human trafficking.
But again, I ask Piers, what does this have to do with the point that she's bringing? She's not making invalid the point that you're bringing, that they've been charged and these things could be true, et cetera, due process and all of that. How does that mitigate? How does that diminish her highlighting of a hypocrisy here?
Sexual abuse, forming an organized crime group. We've just heard from a lawyer representing 4 of the women who says on the evidence he's seen, it's extremely compelling, extremely...
Well, of course, the attorney for these women is going to say that. He's defending them.
...detailed, and that when people see the full...
That's not a defense of the Tates. It's just that's what every attorney who represents their client is going to say.
...full details, they will understand what is really happening here.
I just think there's got to be an end date to it. You cannot keep dragging people to court.
There are other things that mentioned in this back and forth, but I wanted to give you a vivid example of how this looks. And I know some people who will watch this will say, well, he's a Catholic. What can you expect? Guys, this sort of thing happens in Protestant Christian circles all the time. I've seen it happen in church. I've seen it happen amongst Christians. And you have to ask yourself the question, if the Bible is very clear about the dangers of partiality and how it runs afoul of God's example for us, then why is it that Christians aren't following the biblical mandate to not demonstrate partiality and instead are allowing the culture to inform them on partiality and tell them that it's perfectly fine, and then they act that way? That's exactly the point. That's the point I'd like to make vivid. So the question now remains to us: what do we do in order to avoid partiality? It's clearly a sin. It's a grievous sin, and it could lead to other sins, as we have demonstrated. So what do we do? Well, I think the main point, just to simplify it for the audience, is that Webster gave us the key. If you love truth and justice and have that as the baseline by which you judge all things, then you're going to assure yourself that your affections, your will, is not inclined toward partiality, but instead using the baseline of truth and justice by which to judge everything. It's going to give you the superpower, if I can use that terminology. I know it's a bit childish, but to not succumb to the peer pressures that are in place from secular culture to get you to conform to the partiality that sinners demonstrate. It's going to make you, as it were, foolproof against that. It's going to be a shield against that sort of behavior. The pressures will be there. You have to conform. You have to go along to get along, this sort of thing. And you'll say, no, because God demands that I see things according to truth and justice. And this is wrong. It doesn't matter how many friends I lose. It doesn't matter if the money's not going to be coming in, et cetera, et cetera. Truth and justice is the baseline by which, the foundation, the standard by which we live, we Christians live. So it doesn't matter if I liked this person, but now they say something or they do something that runs afoul of Christ. Guess what? My affection is for Christ first and foremost. So it doesn't matter if that person that might have edified me up until this point suddenly has a falling from grace. It's not going to affect me. I'm not going to defend them over that cause suddenly because I have this affection for them that was there in the first place. That's just the way it is. That's the way that truth and justice, and that's the way that God operates, and that's the way that we have to operate. So, but this is let me tell you something. to conclude, this is a gradual process. It's not something that just happens overnight. This is something that you have to ensure that you are practicing on a daily basis. When someone is telling you something that you know to be untrue and you don't fight against that, what's happening? When someone is informing you of something you had not known before and you verify that to be true and it runs against your affections, what will you do then? If you are demonstrated evidence that runs against your inclination, against your tendency to believe that thing, what are you going to do? Are you going to change position, or are you going to continue to insist on your position even though it has been proven to be wrong? You see, these questions make vivid what you have to do as a believer. So that is my advice. That is the biblical counsel. That is the biblical mandate to operate in justice and to operate in truth. Anything else is partiality, and it is a sin, and it runs contrary to God's character. And anything that runs contrary to God's character is essentially a sin, and it's something that we have to abandon. We have to forsake for the sake of living according to truth and justice. I hope this helps you. That's what I have for you on this edition of the Irrespective live stream. A couple of housekeeping items at the end of this live stream. Don't forget to subscribe if you have not done so yet to our Rumble, YouTube, or X page, whichever you prefer. Please subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification bell if you're watching this through YouTube or Rumble to be alerted as to when we go live next, which our next transmission will be on Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I hope that you'll join us for that transmission. Click on that thumbs up button, the like button, and also to share our content with others. Don't forget to donate. It helps us to continue to keep the lights on here in Irrespective. There is a QR code in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that, as you can see, that you can scan. Conversely, there is a link that you can follow in the description box. And last but not least, do not forget to follow us on the socials. Irrespective77 is our username on X, and in TikTok, our username is The Irrespective. That's all the time I have left for this edition. Thank you so much for watching. Until the next occasion that we gather, adieu and Godspeed.